Okay, so that's just a plug for a farmer-led irrigation development network that's being created. And that video can be found on YouTube, and then you can scan through it yourself and pause some of the rather quick graphics. We will slow it down slightly, and there's an email there that you can get in touch with in order to join the network. Thank you for that. So I'm well aware I'm between you and your stomachs, which is even worse than being between you and your brains. So I'm going to talk about farmer-led and system-centered irrigation in Africa. This is just a few insights from a project that I've been involved in with the Overseas Development Institute in London, alongside Steve Wiggins. And I've decided just to use the Star Trek phrase, which apparently was never said. And if I slip into a Spock accent, it's a Spock accent, not an American accent. And he said, it's irrigation. Well, he said, no, it's life, Jim, but not as we know it. So I've transmuted that into it's irrigation, Jim, but not as we know it. So farmer-led irrigation, if it's succeeding, what's the problem? Farmer-led irrigation is materially taking off. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousand hectares are beginning to be developed in Africa, for example, by farmers themselves, and it's arriving on the research agenda. For example, this conference program, the 2018 Kigali Statement, and Ragassa's work in the World Bank. And research finds that there are income benefits to farmers and families, and that farmer-led irrigation is dynamic, and it's opportunity-driven, and it's without cost to government. So the question is, what's the problem? The problem, as I see it, and you're very welcome to differ with me, is that researchers, policymakers, service providers won't see farmer-led irrigation as sufficiently different. We'll end up treating FLI as any other irrigation. In other words, we should agree with Spock. It is irrigation, but not as we know it. I'll try to explain through 3 case studies. So my hypothesis is, my thesis is that we should see irrigation, farmer-led irrigation, as different. And I'm going to do this in 3 ways. First, I'm going to look at the system level, and I'm going to look at resource efficiency. Secondly, I'm going to look at the catchment level, particularly with reference to dry seasons in Africa. And thirdly, I'm going to look at how the state considers irrigation through its master plans, and I'm going to contrast engineering versus entrepreneurial irrigation. So I'm going to go to my system level. What do our problem-fixing tools say about how we view which resources are scarce? And I'm going to contrast the wetting front detector, which you can read about, for example, in many different channels. For example, IMI write about this, for treating or addressing over-irrigation. And I've used, Doug Merry, who I know is in the audience here, I've used in southern Tanzania a social game, a common pool game using marbles, to get farmers to understand how they compete over water and how they understand in their own vernacular who uses too much water versus who is very careful with water. And in this photograph, you can see the game in the top photograph, and in the bottom photograph on the right-hand side, you can see the farmers' notes being drawn up that explore their own understandings of efficient irrigation. Now, of course, ideally, we end up using both tools. They mutually support what I consider to be the true scarce resource, which is collective farmer knowledge on how to maintain systems at scale. And therefore, the wetting front detector becomes a dialogue tool in that, and the river basin game is the conduit to asking about how do I know if I'm over-irrigating. So they mutually support each other. And when we did do the training using the marbles game, when we did do the game, the training that was demanded by the smallholders was on bookkeeping, and I'm going to come back to that as well. So my concerns about seeing irrigation as different is that our implicit assumptions regarding water management is that farmer-led is somehow small-scale, and it fits the catchment, and it's efficient. But these views are not always held. For example, it's quite often the case that you can come across views casting aspersions on farmers. They waste water. And that leads ministries and experts to now intone that farmers need training on land and water management. But actually, as a part of the synthesis report, I started to go through many different publications. It's very difficult to find robust information on the efficiencies and productivities of smallholder irrigation. And a lot of it is quite qualitative, or it has a sort of proxy feel to being quantitative. And that allows ongoing views to do with contrasting gravity with pressurized and drip systems between the differences on irrigation efficiency. And again, if you feel you know differently, please come and see me and point out which publications have genuinely started to understand the efficiency of water management on these different types of systems. I'd love to see them. So therefore, I think we should caution the faith in a lot of the kind of modern technologies that I know we're trialing and testing, given that they will have per hectare issues and collective management issues, particularly to do with maintenance and how they truly work out in terms of their efficiency and productivity. My second question around how we see difference is I'm going to use an S-shaped curve to look at the area of irrigation uptake over time. The S-shaped curve is simply the fact that in stage A, we've got very little irrigation, and therefore policies are trying to push irrigation. They're trying to remove obstacles and get farmers to adopt irrigation. Those are different kinds of policies if irrigation then begins to accelerate and is taken up by farmers. And again, if we move to stage C, when the area of irrigation has exceeded the water supply that's available, and I'm particularly referencing dry season irrigation here, when the amount of water in the dry season or in a drought is a tenth of what is available during a wet season, then again, what kinds of policies are then required in stage C? And you're very free to come and pull my ears around and say this is not correct. But today I've seen few presentations which are often about policies in stage A. How do we push out irrigation? How do we grow irrigation? Rather than how do we research the regulation of irrigation when it grows to too much of an area. And I'm particularly interested in local community ideas around how do we regulate demand. And then my final way of looking at whether we see differences is through national irrigation policy. My view is that in a sense, and I reference here the Rwanda Irrigation Master Plan and the Tanzania Irrigation Master Plan, is that master plans omit an entrepreneurial facilitation of irrigation by the state. Instead, we see a capture of irrigation via an engineering ideal. And these are through four ways. First of all, we view the need to take, somebody used the phrase Mickey Mouse irrigation. If we use traditional monikers and so on and so forth, we therefore need to modernize irrigation. We also need to meet a country's irrigation potential, and that's a very great engineering challenge. It's also delivered through consultancy, and I've been a consultant on irrigation projects myself. And it then requires us to think about a very sort of Rolls-Royce, highly comprehensive set of studies that then delivers on those irrigation plans. And again, I've been part of that. And all four I saw in a NETAFIM stroke Government of Rwanda PPP that is now going to be adopted and applied in northeast Rwanda, looking at 16,000 hectares of drip in an area where there's no irrigation experience, let alone gravity irrigation experience, and in an area where there's no electricity supply either. So how do we situate an entrepreneurial approach to irrigation? Well, very briefly, we have to think about creating the framework by which service providers can engage in irrigation, particularly artisanal local engineers. How do we locate those services close to users? And how do we enable the leasing out of large-scale irrigation equipment? Instead of meeting and fulfilling irrigation potential, how do we track and understand current trajectories and systems, trends, and so on and so forth? Instead of developing comprehensive projects and studies, how do we determine a level of optimal studies, particularly, for example, during dry seasons? And if we're going to collect data on irrigation, let's also collect data on irrigation services and institutions as well as the metrics around area and water withdrawals. Something I saw in Northeast Rwanda, which is not a great appetite for hybridized incremental approaches to irrigation. How do we put gravity and drip and center pivot alongside each other? How do we begin to develop small areas through perhaps the type of engineering that is beyond the remit of communities, so intakes, small dams, and so on and so forth, and then let that seed smallholders to progress the irrigation themselves? What levels of subsidies? What types of tenureship and legal ownership? How do we remove marketing and input obstacles? And how do we embed learning from mistakes and by testing things? And I have no doubt that we make mistakes in irrigation. In fact, the literature is full of critiquing the errors of our ways. But in a sense, if you go and read the Rwandan Irrigation Master Plan, it's not cast there as a way of doing business, as a way of exploring an entrepreneurial way to develop irrigation. And then how do we work on these concerns that we might have that irrigation might rapidly expand and then begin to exceed the water that is available? So in conclusion, and again you can differ with me on this, we should see farmer-led irrigation as different. It's on the agenda, that's fine, so I'm happy that in fact it is beginning to take and get its necessary airtime. And this means that Spock, to return to Star Trek, he's not denying this phenomenon by not saying anything or by saying it's not irrigation, Jim. The risk is that engineering, science, and policy do not see differences between irrigation systems, or even if diversity is seen, we will then default to familiar problem narratives and solutions. And in this case, by not seeing difference, Spock would incorrectly advise his captain, it's irrigation, Jim. The logic of recognizing irrigation diversity, farmer-led irrigation, and other systems types means that we need diversity. We need a diversity of assessment, reform, and support approaches to spend and partner wisely on irrigation to enhance benefits. So Spock is dead correct in saying it's irrigation, Jim, but not as we know it. And that's the background to the study that I've been involved in. Thank you very much.